Millionaire accuses young supermarket cashier of theft, and 2 hours later is shocked when he sees the store's security cameras. The sun rose over the city, bathing the skyscrapers and bustling avenues in golden light. On the top floor of one of those buildings, Richard Thompson gazed at the panorama from his office, his gaze lost on the horizon. At 55 years old, he was the very image of success. Impeccable suit, perfectly groomed salt and pepper hair, and a posture that exuded authority. However, his brown eyes, once sparkling, now looked dull, as if they carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. With a sigh, Richard stepped away from the window and picked up his briefcase. It was time for his monthly visit to one of his supermarkets, a tradition he had maintained since founding his business empire 3 decades ago. As the elevator descended, his mind wandered, as always, to the memory of Emily, his 8-year-old daughter who disappeared without a trace 7 years ago. The supermarket was bustling with activity when Richard entered. Employees and customers alike noticed his presence, some nodding respectfully, others nervously stepping out of his way. Richard walked the aisles with a critical eye, occasionally stopping to inspect a product or ask a curt question to an employee. It was then that he saw her, a young girl of about 15, chestnut hair pulled back in a ponytail, bright green eyes and a kind smile as she helped an elderly woman reach a product from a high shelf. For a moment, Richard's heart skipped a beat. That smile, it was identical to Emily's. Shaking his head to banish those thoughts, Richard continued his tour. However, upon reaching the fruit and vegetable section, he noticed something strange. His gold watch, a Rolex valued at over $50,000, was no longer on his wrist. The initial panic quickly gave way to anger. Richard looked around, searching for the culprit, when his eyes fell again on the young girl with the kind smile. Now she was at the cash register, ringing up a customer. Without thinking twice, Richard approached with long strides. "You!" he shouted, pointing at the girl. "Where's my watch?" The girl, whose name tag read Sarah, looked at him in confusion. "Excuse me, sir, I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb with me," Richard growled, his voice rising with each word. "You were near me a few minutes ago. Give me back my Rolex right now, or I'll call the police." Sarah's face paled, her green eyes widening with fear and surprise. "Sir, I swear I haven't taken anything. You can search me if you want." "But I—" "Silence!" Richard roared, drawing the attention of everyone in the supermarket. "Manager, call security. Right now I want them to check the cameras and search this thief." The manager, a nervous, middle-aged man, nodded frantically and ran towards the security office. Sarah, meanwhile, remained in her place, trembling slightly but with her head held high. Her eyes never leaving Richard's. "Mr. Thompson," she said with a shaky but firm voice, "I assure you, you're making a mistake. I wouldn't steal anything, least of all from you. Please, there must be another explanation." Richard looked at her with disdain. "The only explanation is that you're a thief. You probably saw an opportunity and took it. How much do you think you could get for that watch on the black market? A year's worth of your miserable salary." Richard's words were like daggers, and Sarah felt tears threatening to spill. However, she stood her ground. "Sir, I understand you're upset, but please don't insult me. I'm an honest person and I work hard. I don't need to steal anything." At that moment, the manager came running back, sweat beading on his forehead. "Mr. Thompson, we've reviewed the camera footage from the last 30 minutes. Richard turned to him, a triumphant smile forming on his lips. "Well, where's my watch?" The manager swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir, your watch. It fell off your wrist when you were inspecting products in aisle 3. It's under the canned goods shelf." A deathly silence fell over the supermarket. Richard felt the color drain from his face, shame and guilt quickly replacing anger. Sarah, for her part, let out a sigh of relief, but her eyes now shone with a mixture of pain and resentment. I, Richard stammered, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. "Can I return to my work now, sir?" Sarah asked, her voice cold as ice. Richard nodded mechanically, unable to meet her eyes. As the manager ran to retrieve the watch, Richard noticed something he had overlooked in his fit of anger, a small pendant hanging from Sarah's neck, a pendant he would recognize anywhere in the world. The same pendant he had given Emily the day before her disappearance. The world seemed to stop for Richard. The voices around him became a distant murmur, and all he could see was that small piece of metal shining against Sarah's skin. "That pendant," he muttered, extending a trembling hand towards it. Sarah instinctively took a step back, her hand clutching the pendant protectively. "What about it?" Richard looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. Those green eyes, that nose shape, those lips. How had he not seen it before? Where did you get it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah frowned, clearly confused by Richard's sudden change in behavior. "I've always had it. It's the only thing I have from my real family. I grew up in an orphanage, and this is all I have left of my past." The words hit Richard like a punch to the stomach. His mind worked at full speed, connecting dots, remembering dates. Sarah was the age Emily would be now. The pendant, the resemblance. "Sarah," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "I need you to listen to me carefully. That pendant, I gave it to my daughter many years ago. She disappeared when she was 8 years old and never—" The words died in his throat as he saw the look of shock on Sarah's face. The young girl took another step back, her hand still clutching the pendant as if it were a lifeline. "No," she said, shaking her head. "No, this can't be you. You just accused me of theft. You can't just come now and say that I could be—" "Please," Richard pleaded, extending a hand towards her. "I know I just made a terrible mistake, but this is bigger than that. If there's any chance that you're Emily, my daughter, we need to know." Sarah looked at him, her eyes filled with confusion, fear, and a hint of something else. "Hope. I don't know what to say. This is too much." At that moment, the manager returned with the watch, breaking the tension of the moment. "Mr. Thompson, here's your watch. It's in perfect condition." Richard took the watch mechanically, without taking his eyes off Sarah. "Thank you," he muttered. Then, addressing Sarah, he said, "I know this is sudden and that I have no right to ask you anything after how I've treated you, but please, could we talk? There's so much I need to know, so much to explain." Sarah looked around. Noticing that all eyes were on them, customers and employees alike watched the scene with a mixture of curiosity and amazement. "Not here," she finally said. "My shift ends in an hour. If you really want to talk, we can meet at the coffee shop on the corner." Richard nodded, grateful for the opportunity. "I'll be there," he promised. As Sarah returned to her post at the cash register, visibly shaken, Richard headed for the supermarket exit. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: guilt for having unjustly accused Sarah, hope at the possibility of having found his lost daughter, and fear that it was all a cruel coincidence. As he stepped out onto the street, the afternoon sun momentarily blinded him. Richard blinked, adjusting to the light, and for an instant, he thought he saw Emily's silhouette, his little 8-year-old, running towards him with open arms, but when he focused his gaze, the image vanished, leaving only the bustle of the city. With a shaky sigh, Richard headed towards the coffee shop. The next hour would be the longest of his life, but it could also be the beginning of something he had thought lost forever. Hope. The coffee shop on the corner was a cozy place, with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee permeating the air and the soft murmur of conversations filling the space. Richard Thompson, seated at a table away from the entrance, absent-mindedly stirred his coffee without taking a sip. His eyes never left the door, anxiously awaiting Sarah's arrival. The minutes passed like hours, and with each passing second, Richard's mind filled with more doubts and questions. What if Sarah decided not to come? What if it was all a cruel coincidence? How could he explain his behavior at the supermarket? Just as the clock marked an hour since their encounter at the supermarket, the coffee shop door opened. Sarah entered, her gaze scanning the place until it rested on Richard for a moment. She seemed to hesitate, but then she straightened her shoulders and walked towards him. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice tense but polite. Richard quickly stood up, almost spilling his coffee. "Sarah, thank you for coming. Please, sit down." The young girl took a seat across from him, her hands clasped on the table, the pendant shining softly under the coffee shop light. "First of all," Richard began, "I want to sincerely apologize for my behavior at the supermarket. It was inexcusable, and I understand if you can't forgive me." Sarah looked at him silently for a moment before responding, "I appreciate your apology, Mr. Thompson, but you'll understand that an apology doesn't erase what happened. You accused me of being a thief in front of all my co-workers and customers, that's not something easily forgotten." Richard nodded, shame evident on his face. "I know, and I don't expect you to forget. I only hope that you can give me the chance to explain and maybe to understand what's going on here." Sarah took a deep breath. "All right, let's talk about this pendant and why you think I could be your daughter." Richard pulled a worn photograph from his pocket and placed it on the table. In it, you could see a small girl of about 8 years old with bright green eyes and a radiant smile. Around her neck hung the same pendant that Sarah now wore. "This is Emily, my daughter," said Richard, his voice cracking with emotion. "She disappeared 7 years ago, right after her 8th birthday. I had given her that pendant the day before. It's a unique piece, designed specifically for her." Sarah took the photograph with trembling hands, her eyes moving from the image to Richard and back. I don't remember anything before. The orphanage. They told me I was found wandering alone on the street when I was about 8 years old. I had no identification, just this pendant." Richard felt his heart racing. "Sarah, would you mind if we did a DNA test? I know it's a lot to ask, but it's the only way to be sure." Sarah remained silent for a moment, her fingers absently caressing the pendant. Finally, she looked up at Richard. "Okay," she said quietly. "Let's do the test. But I want you to understand something, Mr. Thompson. Even if it turns out that I am Emily, that doesn't change the last 7 years of my life. It doesn't change who I am now." Richard nodded, a mixture of relief and anxiety on his face. "I understand, Sarah, and I promise you that whatever the result, I'll respect your decisions." The following days were an emotional roller coaster for both of them. Richard quickly arranged for a private DNA test, eager to get answers as soon as possible. While they waited for the results, Sarah continued with her normal life, working at the supermarket and dealing with the curious looks from her co-workers who had witnessed the incident. A week later, Richard received a call from the laboratory. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope containing the results. His eyes scanned the document, stopping at the final line. Probability of paternity, 99.99999%. With his heart racing, Richard called Sarah and asked her to meet him again at the coffee shop. When she arrived, he handed her the envelope without saying a word. Sarah read the document, her eyes widening with each line. When she finished, she looked up at Richard, tears forming in her eyes. "It's true," she whispered. I am Emily." Richard felt an enormous weight lift from his shoulders, only to be replaced by another. He had found his daughter, yes, but what did this mean for both of them now? "Sarah Emily," he began, unsure how to address her, "I know this is overwhelming. I want you to know that I don't expect things to change overnight, but I would like the opportunity to get to know you, to be part of your life, if you'll allow me." Sarah nodded slowly, still processing the information. "I need time," she finally said. This changes everything. I thought I knew about myself. I need to think. I need to understand what this means for me." Richard nodded, respecting her decision. "Of course, take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready to talk." As Sarah stood up to leave, Richard couldn't help but notice how much she resembled his late wife. The same poise, the same determination in her eyes. He wondered how much of Emily remained in Sarah and how much had changed in the last 7 years. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions for both of them. Richard struggled with the guilt of not having found his daughter sooner, wondering what had happened in those 7 years that kept them apart. Sarah, for her part, faced an identity crisis. Was she Sarah or Emily? How did this new information fit into the life she had built for herself? Meanwhile, in a maximum security prison on the outskirts of the city, Michael Adams, Richard's former business partner, received an unexpected visit. A guard approached his cell with an envelope in hand. "Adams, you've got mail," said the guard, sliding the envelope through the door slot. Michael took the envelope with curiosity. He didn't usually receive correspondence. Upon opening it, his eyes widened as he saw its contents: a recent photograph of Sarah working at the supermarket and a note that simply said, "He found her." A sinister smile spread across Michael's face. "So you finally found her, old friend," he muttered to himself. "But the question is, are you prepared for the consequences?" The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into a month. Sarah, still grappling with the revelation of her true identity, had kept her distance from Richard, communicating only through occasional text messages. Richard, respecting her space, was content knowing that his daughter was alive and safe, although the emotional distance between them pained him. Deeply one afternoon, as Sarah finished her shift at the supermarket, she received a message from Richard. "Sarah, I know you need time and space, and I respect that. But there are things about your disappearance that I think you should know. Could we meet tomorrow? I promise not to push you beyond what you're comfortable with." Sarah stared at the message for several minutes, debating internally. Finally, she responded with a simple, "Okay." Same coffee shop, 3 p.m. The next day, Richard arrived at the coffee shop half an hour early, nervous and anxious about what he was about to reveal. When Sarah entered, she immediately noticed the tension on Richard's face. "Thank you for coming," Richard said as Sarah sat across from him. "What's this all about?" Sarah asked, getting straight to the point. Richard took a deep breath. "It's about the night you disappeared and about Michael Adams." The name made Sarah visibly tense. "Michael Adams? Your ex-partner? What does he have to do with this?" "Everything," Richard replied. Regretfully, "Michael, he was the one who orchestrated your kidnapping." The revelation fell like a bomb on Sarah. "What? Why? How do you know?" Richard pulled a folder from his briefcase and placed it on the table. "A few years ago, I hired a private investigator to continue investigating your disappearance. He found evidence linking Michael to the incident. He confessed everything when I confronted him, just before he was arrested for fraud." Sarah opened the folder with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the documents and photographs detailing the investigation. "But why? Why did he kidnap me?" Richard closed his eyes, the pain evident on his face. "It was for money and power. Michael wanted to take control of the company. He knew that if he kidnapped you, I would be too devastated to focus on the business. He planned to use that to his advantage to take control." Sarah felt short of breath. Her entire life, or at least what she remembered of it, had been shaped by the greed of a man she didn't even know. And the orphanage. How did I end up there? According to Michael's confession, he kept you hidden for a while, but things got complicated. Fearing discovery, he left you in a distant city, knowing you would probably end up in an orphanage. Tears began to run down Sarah's cheeks. Years of unanswered questions, of feeling abandoned and rootless, all took on a new and painful meaning. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked, her voice broken with emotion. Richard reached his hand across the table, but stopped short of touching Sarah's. "I wanted to protect you. I wanted to be sure you were Emily before revealing something so painful. And honestly, I was afraid that you would blame me for not protecting you, for not finding you. Sooner." Sarah stood up abruptly, needing space to process all this information. I need air," she said, quickly heading towards the exit. Richard followed her, concerned. "Sarah, please, I know it's a lot to take in, but—" "No!" Sarah shouted, turning to face him on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop. "You have no idea what this is like for me. My whole life, my whole identity has been a lie, and you knew and didn't. Tell me—" "I'm sorry," Richard said, his voice laden with remorse. "I know I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid of losing you again." Sarah looked at him, her eyes full of confusion and pain. "You already lost me 7 years ago, Richard, and now I don't know who I am. I don't know if I'm Sarah or Emily. I don't know if I can be your daughter. With those words, Sarah turned and quickly walked away, leaving Richard alone on the sidewalk, devastated and not knowing what to do. Meanwhile, in prison, Michael Adams received another unexpected visit. This time, it was his lawyer. "Mr. Adams," said the lawyer, "I have news. We've found a technicality in your case. There's a possibility we could get a significant reduction in your sentence, maybe even early release." Michael smiled, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Excellent," he said. "It seems things are about to get very interesting for the Thompsons." The days following the revelation were a whirlwind of emotions for Sarah. She immersed herself in her work at the supermarket, trying to maintain an appearance of normalcy, while her mind buzzed with unanswered questions and conflicting emotions. At night, she spent hours looking at old photographs of Emily that Richard had provided, searching in that smiling girl for some glimpse of the person she had become. Richard, for his part, respected the space Sarah needed, but worry consumed him. Each day that passed without news from her was torture. He debated between the desire to protect her and the need to give her the freedom to process everything on her own. A week after their last conversation, Sarah finally sent a message to Richard. "I need to talk to you. Can you come to my apartment tonight?" Richard's heart skipped a beat as he read the message. He immediately responded, confirming he would be there. That night, Richard found himself in front of the door of Sarah's modest apartment, his hand trembling slightly as he rang the doorbell. When Sarah opened the door, Richard immediately noticed the dark circles under her eyes, evidence of sleepless nights. "Come in," Sarah said, her voice tired but firm. Once inside, Richard observed the small but cozy space. Photos of Sarah with friends from the orphanage and co-workers decorated the walls, a tangible reminder of the life she had built without him. "I've been thinking a lot," Sarah began, sitting on the couch and indicating that Richard should do the same, "about who I am, about my past, about everything." Richard nodded, patiently waiting for her to continue. "I can't deny that I'm Emily," Sarah said, her eyes fixed on her clasped hands. "The evidence is clear, but I also can't simply stop being Sarah. This is the person I've become, the life I've built." "I understand," Richard said softly. "I don't expect you to stop being who you are now." Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting Richard's. "I want to get to know you, Richard. I want to know about the family I come from, about the life I had before, but I need you to understand that this will be on my terms. I can't just go back to being your little Emily." Richard felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. "Of course, how do you prefer I call you?" "Sarah," she replied with a small smile. "At least for now." "Sarah," Richard repeated, nodding. "I'm willing to do this however you want. I just want the opportunity to be part of your life." "Good," Sarah said, straightening up. "Because I have some conditions. First, I want to know everything about Michael Adams and my kidnapping. No more secrets, no more attempts to protect me. I need the whole truth." Richard nodded solemnly. "I'll tell you everything, I promise." "Second," Sarah continued, "I want to keep my job at the supermarket and my apartment. At least for now, I'm not ready to immerse myself in a life of luxury that I don't know." "Understood," said Richard, although part of him yearned to be able to give her everything she hadn't had during these years. "And third," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly, "I want to visit my mother's grave. I know she died shortly after my disappearance, and I need to connect with that part of my past too." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. "Of course," he managed to say. "I'll take you when you're ready." Sarah nodded. A weight seemed to have lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you, Richard. I know this isn't easy for you either." "Whatever it takes," Richard said sincerely. "I'm here for you, Sarah, always." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the distant sound of city traffic. Finally, Sarah spoke again. "There's something else I need to know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What was she like?" "My mother." Richard felt his heart constrict at the question. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering his late wife's face. "Catherine was extraordinary." He began, his voice laden with emotion. "She had your eyes, you know. Green and bright, always full of curiosity. She was intelligent, compassionate, and had a laugh that could light up an entire room." Sarah listened attentively, drinking in every word as if it were water in the desert. She was an architect, Richard continued. She had a gift for seeing beauty in the simplest things and transforming them into something extraordinary. It was she who designed our family home, you know. Every corner has a bit of her essence. What happened to her? Sarah asked softly. Richard took a deep breath. After your disappearance, Catherine, she consumed herself. She spent days and nights looking for you, following every lead no matter how small. She didn't sleep, barely ate. Her health deteriorated rapidly. The doctors said it was a heart attack, but I know she died of grief. She loved you so much, Sarah. We both did. Tears were now flowing freely down Sarah's cheeks. I'm so sorry, she said between sobs. If only I could remember. Richard instinctively moved closer, hesitating for a moment before wrapping Sarah in his arms. To his surprise, she didn't pull away, but sank into his embrace, letting out years of repressed pain. It's not your fault, Richard murmured, gently stroking her hair. None of this is your fault. They remained like that for several minutes, until Sarah's sobs subsided. When they finally separated, there was a new understanding between them, a bridge beginning to form over the abyss of lost years. Thank you for telling me about her, Sarah said, wiping away her tears. I'd like to know more when I'm ready. Richard nodded, a small smile on his lips. I have photo albums, home videos. Whenever you want to see them, they'll be waiting for you. Sarah returned the smile, weak but genuine. I'd like that. Meanwhile, in prison, Michael Adams was preparing for a crucial hearing. His lawyer had managed to find a legal technicality that could result in a significant reduction of his sentence. Remember, Mr. Adams, said the lawyer as they reviewed the strategy, maintain your composure at all times. Show remorse, regret. The judge needs to believe that. You have changed. Michael nodded, his face a perfect mask of contrition. Of course I'm a changed man, after all. But behind that facade, his mind was working at full speed. If he managed to get out, if he gained his freedom, he had plans. Plans that would involve Richard and the newly discovered Sarah. Soon, old friend, he muttered to himself as he was escorted to the courtroom. Soon we'll settle accounts. The following days marked the beginning of a fragile but hopeful relationship between Richard and Sarah. They started with small steps, occasional lunches, short visits to Sarah's apartment, and long phone conversations at night. Little by little, Sarah began to open up, asking questions about her childhood, about the life she had before the kidnapping one afternoon. As they shared a coffee in the park near Sarah's apartment, she asked a question that took Richard by surprise. What was I like? I mean, what was Emily like? Richard smiled nostalgically. You are a force of nature. Even at 8 years old, you had a determination that surprised everyone. I remember once. When you were 6, you decided you wanted to learn to play the piano. You would spend hours sitting in front of your mother's old piano, practicing until your little fingers hurt. Sarah listened intently, trying to imagine that determined child. Did I play well? Richard chuckled softly. Honestly, at first it sounded like a cat was walking on the keys, but you improved quickly. For your 7th birthday, you surprised us all by playing Happy Birthday perfectly. A small smile formed on Sarah's lips. I wish I could remember that. Maybe. Richard hesitated for a moment. Maybe you could try playing again. Your mother's piano is still at home. It could be a way to reconnect with that part of you. Sarah considered the offer for a moment. Perhaps, but I'm not sure I'm ready to visit the family home yet. Richard nodded, understanding. When you're ready, there's no rush. As they talked, neither of them noticed the figure watching them from a distance, hidden behind a newspaper. On a nearby bench, Michael Adams, recently released thanks to the legal technicality and his lawyer's skill, couldn't believe his luck. There they were, Richard and the girl he had kidnapped so many years ago, completely unaware of his presence. How touching, he muttered to himself with a sarcastic smile. The family happily reunited. His mind worked at full speed, planning his next move. The early release had given him an opportunity he wasn't going to waste. Richard Thompson had taken everything from him, his freedom, his reputation, his fortune. Now it was time to return the blow, and what better way to do it than through the newly recovered daughter. Meanwhile, Sarah and Richard continued their conversation, oblivious to the danger looming over them. "There's something I've wanted to ask you," Sarah said, her voice turning serious. "About the orphanage where I grew up." Richard visibly tensed. "What do you want to know?" "When you told me about Michael and the kidnapping, you mentioned that he left me in a distant city, but the orphanage where I grew up is here in this same city. How is that possible?" Richard paled. This was a part of the story he had hoped not to have to tell so soon. "Sarah, there's something you need to know about the orphanage, something I discovered during the investigation." Sarah looked at him expectantly, a feeling of unease growing inside her. "The orphanage where you grew up was founded by a charitable organization linked to Michael Adams' companies." The revelation fell like a bomb on Sarah. "What? Are you saying that the man who kidnapped me was also behind the place where I grew up?" Richard nodded gravely. "We didn't know until years later Michael had established a network of orphanages as part of an elaborate philanthropic facade. It was his way of laundering money, and at the same time, maintaining a respectable public image." Sarah stood up abruptly, anger and confusion evident on her face. "So everything was a lie? My whole childhood was part of his plan?" "No, Sarah, it's not like that," Richard said, trying to calm her. "The caregivers, the other children, your experiences there, all of that was real. Michael only provided the funding. He didn't control the day-to-day operations of the orphanage." But Sarah barely heard him. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions and questions. How much of her life had been manipulated by this man she didn't even know? Was there anything in her past that was genuinely hers? "I need to be alone," she finally said, picking up her purse. "I need to process all of this." "Sarah, please," Richard tried, but she was already quickly walking away. From his hiding place, Michael observed the scene with interest. Sarah's evident distress and Richard's frustration were exactly what he had hoped to see. "Seems things aren't going so well in paradise," he muttered to himself. "Perhaps it's the perfect time for a little family reunion." As Sarah walked away, fighting back tears, and Richard stood behind, helpless and worried, Michael began to plot his next move. The game had barely begun, and he had all the pieces right where he wanted them. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions for Sarah. Every aspect of her life, every memory, now seemed tainted by Michael Adams' shadow. She immersed herself in her work at the supermarket, seeking comfort in routine and familiarity. But even there, intrusive thoughts haunted her. One afternoon, while organizing products on the shelves, she felt a presence behind her. Turning around, she found herself face to face with a middle-aged man, graying, hair and piercing eyes that looked at her with an unsettling intensity. "Excuse me," the man said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Could you help me find something?" There was something in his voice, in the way he looked at her, that made Sarah instinctively tense. "Of course, sir, what are you looking for?" "Oh, many things," the man responded enigmatically, "but for now, I'll settle for knowing where the canned goods are." Sarah pointed towards the corresponding aisle, eager to get away from this strange customer. But before she could move, the man spoke again. "You know, you remind me a lot of someone I knew a long time ago. A little girl with the same green eyes as you. Curious, isn't it?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "It couldn't be, who are you?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The man smiled again, this time with a malicious glint in his eyes. "I think you already know Emily, or do you prefer Sarah now?" Sarah felt short of breath. In front of her was Michael Adams, the man who had destroyed her life, the architect of her suffering. "What do you want?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling slightly. "Just to chat," Michael responded with feigned innocence. "So many years have passed and there's so much to talk about. How about we meet after your shift? I promise it will be enlightening." Before Sarah could respond, Michael walked away, disappearing among the supermarket aisles. Sarah stood there, paralyzed, her mind a whirlwind of fear, anger, and confusion. Meanwhile, in his office, Richard struggled with his own demons. The distance Sarah had put between them, since the revelation about the orphanage was consuming him, He wanted to respect her space, but the fear of losing her again tormented him. Determined to do something, he picked up his phone and dialed Sarah's number. After several rings, the call went to voicemail. "Sarah," he said after the beep, "I know, you need time and I respect that, but I want you to know that I'm here for you, no matter what. If you need to talk, if you need anything, just call me. I love you, daughter." He hung up the phone, feeling helpless. How could he protect his daughter from a past she didn't even fully remember? Back at the supermarket, Sarah finished her shift, her mind still reeling from the encounter with Michael. Part of her wanted to call Richard, tell him everything, seek his protection. But another part, the part that still struggled with the idea of being Emily, the lost daughter of a millionaire, wanted to face this alone. As she left the supermarket, she saw Michael waiting in a car parked across the street. With her heart pounding, Sarah made a decision. She crossed the street and approached the car. "Talk," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "What is it that you want?" Michael smiled, opening the passenger door. "Get in. We have a lot to talk about, and believe me, you'll want to hear what I have to say." Sarah hesitated for a moment. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to walk away, to call Richard, to seek help. But the need for answers, to finally understand her past, was stronger. With one last glance around, Sarah got into the car. "Good decision," said Michael, starting the engine. "It's time you knew the truth, the whole truth about who you really are and why your life has been the way it has been." As the car drove away, Sarah couldn't help but feel she was crossing a point of no return. Michael's car moved away from the supermarket, taking her towards an uncertain and potentially dangerous destination. The silence in the car was palpable. As Michael drove through the city streets, Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the road, her mind racing with 1,000 questions and fears. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, breaking the tense silence. Michael smiled without taking his eyes off the road. "To a place where we can talk without interruptions, a place that, I think, you'll find quite familiar." After about 30 minutes of driving, the car stopped in front of an old but well-maintained building. Sarah felt her heart stop for a moment as she recognized it. It was the orphanage where she had grown up. "Why have you brought me here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Because this is where everything began and where everything must be revealed," Michael replied, getting out of the car and gesturing for Sarah to follow him. With hesitant steps, Sarah followed Michael into the building. The familiar smell, the arrangement of the furniture, everything brought with it a wave of memories, some good, others not. So much Michael led her to an office on the second floor. Once inside, he closed the door and sat behind the desk, indicating Sarah to take a seat in front of him. "Well, Emily or Sarah, as you prefer," Michael began, his eyes fixed on her. "I suppose you have many questions." Sarah nodded, her mouth dry with nervousness. "Why?" she managed to ask. "Why did you do all this? Why did you ruin my life?" Michael let out a bitter laugh. "Ruin your life? My dear, I saved you." "What?" Sarah looked at him in disbelief. "You kidnapped me. You took me away from my family. I took you away from a man who was willing to sacrifice his own daughter for power and money," Michael interrupted, his voice laden with an emotion Sarah couldn't identify. "What are you talking about?" Sarah asked, confused and scared. Michael leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Sarah's. "Your father, Richard Thompson, is not the saint he pretends to be. The night of your disappearance, he was negotiating a multi-million-dollar deal with foreign investors who had connections to human trafficking." Sarah felt short of breath. "No, that can't be true. He's been looking for me for years." "Oh, of course he has," Michael responded sarcastically, "to save his public image. But the truth is that night Richard was willing to hand you over as part of the deal. I found out and couldn't allow it, so I got you out of there and brought you here, where you would be safe." Sarah's mind was a whirlwind. Could it be true? Was the man who had been trying to reconnect with her, the father who seemed to love her so much, capable of such a thing? "I don't believe you," she finally said, although her voice betrayed her doubt. Michael smiled sadly. I knew you'd say that. That's why I've kept this all these years." He pulled a folder from a desk drawer and slid it towards Sarah. "Here are the documents of the deal, the communications between Richard and the investors. It's all there." With trembling hands, Sarah opened the folder. The documents seemed authentic, official, letterhead, signatures, dates that coincided with the night of her disappearance. As she read, she felt her world crumbling. "But why did you leave me at the orphanage? Why didn't you tell me the truth before?" she asked, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "To protect you," Michael replied. "If I had kept you with me, Richard would have eventually found you. Here at the orphanage, you were safe and could have a normal life. And now that you're an adult, now that you can understand and defend yourself, I thought it was time for you to know the truth." Sarah stood up abruptly, needing space to process all of this. She walked to the window, looking out at the orphanage courtyard where she had spent so many hours playing, not knowing that her entire life was an elaborate lie. "What am I supposed to do now with this information?" she asked, her voice broken by emotion. Michael stood up and approached her, placing a hand on her shoulder in a gesture that was meant to be comforting. "That's up to you, Sarah. You can confront Richard, demand the truth from him, or you can walk away from him forever, protect yourself from his influence. I'll be here to support you, whatever your decision." Sarah turned to look at him, her eyes full of tears and confusion. "Why should I trust you? You've lied to me all these years too." "Because unlike Richard, I have nothing to gain from this," Michael replied. "My life is already ruined. I just want you to know the truth and be safe." At that moment, Sarah's phone began to ring. On the screen, Richard's name was flashing insistently. "It's him," Sarah said, showing the screen to Michael. "The decision is yours," Michael said, taking a step back. "You can answer and continue living in the lie, or you can turn off the phone and start living your life on your own terms." Sarah looked at the phone, then at Michael and back at the phone. Her finger hovered over the answer button, trembling slightly. At that moment, her entire life, past and future, seemed to depend on this simple decision. Would she answer? Would she confront Richard with this new information? Or would she turn off the phone and walk away from everything and everyone she had come to know in recent weeks? The answer to these questions would change the course of her life forever. The sound of the phone resonated in the office, each ring seeming to last an eternity. Sarah stared fixedly at the screen, Richard's name flashing insistently. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, trust and betrayal, love and hate, hope and despair. Finally, with a quick motion, Sarah rejected the call and turned off the phone. Michael smiled subtly. "You've made a wise decision, Sarah. Now we can talk without interruptions." But Sarah wasn't listening. Her mind was elsewhere, recalling every interaction she had had with Richard since their reunion. Were there signs of deception in his eyes, guilt in his voice, or had it all been a masterful performance? "I need time," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "I need to think, to process all of this." Michael nodded, understandingly. "Of course, take all the time you need. But remember, Sarah, now that you know the truth, you can't go back to ignorance. Every moment you spend with Richard will be a moment when you'll be in danger." Sarah shuddered at his words. "What do you suggest I do?" "Disappear," Michael replied without hesitation. "Start a new life, far from here, far from Richard, and everything he represents. I can help you do it, give you the resources you need to start over." The offer was tempting, an opportunity to escape all the pain, the confusion, the lies, but something inside Sarah resisted. "I can't just leave," she said, shaking her head. "I have friends, a job, a life here." "A life built on lies," Michael reminded her. "Can you really continue living like this, knowing what you know now?" Sarah had no answer for that. She felt trapped, torn between the desire to flee and the need to face the truth, whatever it might be. "I need to get out of here," she finally said, heading towards the door. Michael didn't try to stop her. "I'll be here when you're ready to talk again. Remember, Sarah, I only want what's best for you." Sarah left the orphanage feeling more lost than ever. The city streets, once familiar and comforting, now seemed strange and threatening. Every face that passed could be a spy for Richard. Every shadow could hide a danger. Not knowing where to go, Sarah wandered the city for hours. Her steps eventually led her to a small park where she used to play as a child during her rare days out from the orphanage. She sat on a bench watching children play, their laughter a painful reminder of the childhood that was stolen from her. Meanwhile, in his mansion, Richard was frantic. He had tried calling Sarah several times, each unanswered call, increasing his anxiety. What if something had happened to her? What if someone had recognized her? And no, he couldn't allow himself to think like that. Making a decision, Richard grabbed his keys and left the mansion. He would drive to Sarah's apartment and wait there until she appeared. He needed to see her, make sure she was okay. In the park, Sarah finally made a decision. She couldn't run away, not without confronting Richard first. She needed to hear his version of the story, to see his eyes when she asked him about that fateful night. With trembling hands, she turned on her phone immediately. An avalanche of notifications of missed calls and messages from Richard flooded the screen. The last message simply said, "I'm at your apartment. Please, Sarah, I need to know you're okay." Sarah took a deep breath. It was time to face the truth, whatever it might be. With determined steps, she headed towards her apartment, towards the confrontation that would change her life forever. As she walked, she didn't notice the figure following her at a distance, observing her every move. Michael Adams smiled to himself. The pieces were in place. Soon, very soon, he would have his revenge. Sarah's heart was pounding as she climbed the stairs to her apartment. Each step brought her closer to a truth she feared but needed to know. When she reached her door, she paused for a moment, gathering the courage necessary for what was to come next. As she opened the door, she saw Richard sitting on the couch, his face a mask of worry and relief upon seeing her. "Sarah!" he exclaimed, quickly standing up. "Thank God you're okay, I was so worried." But he stopped when he saw the expression on Sarah's face. It wasn't the look of a daughter relieved to see her father, it was the look of someone who had seen behind the veil and didn't like what she had found. "We need to talk," Sarah said, her voice cold and distant. Richard nodded slowly, feeling that something had irrevocably changed. "Of course. What's going on?" Sarah closed the door behind her and remained standing, maintaining the distance between them. "I want you to tell me about the night I disappeared." "Everything." Richard visibly paled. "Sarah, I've already told you everything I know. It was a normal night. You were in your room, and when we went to check on you in the morning, you had disappeared." "You're lying," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "That night, you were negotiating a deal that involved me." Richard's eyes widened. "What? Sarah, I don't know what you're talking about. Who told you that?" "Michael Adams," Sarah replied, carefully observing Richard's reaction. Richard's face went from shock to anger in a matter of seconds. "Michael, you've talked to him. Sarah, that man is dangerous. You can't believe a word he says." "He showed me documents, Richard," Sarah continued, pulling out copies of the papers Michael had given her. "Documents that prove you were willing to hand me over as part of a deal with human traffickers." Richard took the documents with trembling hands, his eyes quickly scanning the pages. This is a forgery, Sarah. You have to believe me. I would never do something like that. You're my daughter. I love you more than anything in this world." Sarah wanted to believe him. Part of her screamed to trust the man who had been searching for her for years, who had cried with joy upon finding her. But another part, the part that had grown up distrusting the world, told her to be careful. "Then explain to me," she said, crossing her arms. "Explain to me why these documents exist, why Michael has them, and why I should believe you and not them." Richard ran a hand through his hair, visibly distressed. "Sarah, that night I was indeed negotiating a deal, but it wasn't anything illegal and it certainly didn't involve you. It was a business agreement with a foreign company to expand our operations." "And Michael?" Sarah asked, still skeptical. "Michael was my partner back then," Richard explained. He was aware of the deal, but he didn't agree with the expansion. He wanted to keep the business more controlled. We had a big argument that night right before we discovered your disappearance." Sarah processed every word, looking for signs of deception. "Why hadn't you told me this before?" "Because I'm ashamed," Richard admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "That night, I was so focused on the business that I didn't pay you the attention I should have. I blame myself every day for that. If I had been more attentive, maybe you would have been safe." Tears began to form in Sarah's eyes. She wanted to believe him, but years of distrust don't vanish easily. "How do you explain these documents then?" Richard looked at the papers again. "These are elaborate, but they're forgeries. Look at the date at the top. It's from 7 years ago, but look at the company logo. This design was implemented only 5 years ago. It's a mistake that someone who wasn't inside the company could easily make." Sarah took the documents, examining them carefully. Indeed, the detail Richard pointed out was evident once he mentioned it. "Michael was always skilled with details," Richard continued, "but even he can make mistakes, Sarah. I know it's hard to believe after everything you've been through, but I swear on your mother's memory that I would never ever have put you in danger." The mention of her mother made Sarah look up. She saw tears in Richard's eyes, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "Your mother," Richard said, his voice barely a whisper. "She would never have forgiven me if I had done anything to hurt you. And I would never have forgiven myself." At that moment, something changed in the atmosphere of the room. The barrier of distrust that Sarah had erected began to crack. "I want to believe you," she finally said, her voice broken with emotion. "But I'm afraid of trusting and getting hurt again." Richard took a step towards her, extending his hand, but not touching her, respecting her. "Space. I know and I understand. I'm not asking you to trust me completely right away. I'm just asking for the chance to show you day by day that you are the most important thing in my life." Sarah looked at Richard's extended hand, hesitating for a moment. Then, slowly, she took it. "Okay," she said, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "But I need you to be completely honest with me from now on. No secrets, no half-truths." Richard nodded, gently squeezing Sarah's hand. "I promise you, total transparency." Just when it seemed that father and daughter had taken a step towards reconciliation, Sarah's phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. "The truth always comes to light. Don't trust sweet words. I have more evidence. Meet me in the park at midnight if you want to really know who Richard Thompson is." Sarah looked at the message, her heart racing again. When she looked up, she saw Richard looking at her with concern. "Everything okay?" he asked. Sarah hesitated for a moment. Should she tell him? About the message? About Michael? Part of her wanted to trust Richard fully, but another part still harbored doubts. "Yes," she finally replied, putting the phone away. "Everything's fine." But while Richard smiled, relieved, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that tonight at midnight she would have to make a decision that would change the course of her life forever. The hours that followed the confrontation were tense but hopeful. Richard and Sarah talked at length, sharing stories from the past and expectations for the future. As the night progressed, Sarah felt her trust in her father, slowly growing. But the shadow of Michael's message still weighed on her mind. When the clock struck 11:30 p.m., Sarah felt her heart begin to race. She had to make a decision: stay with Richard and trust him fully, or go to meet Michael and find out if there were more secrets to be revealed. "It's late," Richard said, looking at his watch. "Maybe I should go and let you rest." Sarah nodded, grateful for the opportunity to be alone with her. Thoughts: "Yes, it's been a long day. Thank you for everything." Richard stood up, hesitating a moment before hugging Sarah. She tensed initially, but then relaxed into the embrace, allowing herself for a brief instant to feel like the child she once was, safe in her father's arms. "I love you, Sarah," Richard said softly. "Never forget that." When Richard left, Sarah stood staring at the closed door, her mind a whirlwind of emotions and doubts. She looked at the clock. 11:45 p.m. If she was going to go to the park, she had to leave now. With her heart pounding heavily, Sarah took her jacket and left the apartment. The streets were almost deserted at this hour, and every shadow seemed to hide a potential danger. When she arrived at the park, it was just minutes to midnight. The park was shrouded in darkness, illuminated only by a few scattered street lamps. Sarah advanced cautiously, her eyes scanning every corner for Michael. "I'm glad you came," said a voice behind her. Making her startle, Sarah turned to find herself face to face with Michael Adams. "What else do you have to tell me?" she asked, trying to maintain her composure. Michael smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "It's not what I have to tell you, but what I have to show you." He pulled an envelope from his jacket and handed it to Sarah. With trembling hands, Sarah opened the envelope. Inside were photographs: Richard meeting with suspicious-looking men, documents with official signatures and seals, and most disturbingly, a photo of her as a child, asleep in what appeared to be the back seat of a car. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The truth that Richard doesn't want you to know," Michael replied. "That night he handed you over to those men. I managed to intercept them and rescue you before it was too late." Sarah felt short of breath. The photos seemed authentic, but how could she be sure? "Why should I believe you?" "Because unlike Richard, I have nothing to gain from this," Michael said. "My life is already ruined. I just want you to know the truth and be safe." At that moment, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted the conversation. Sarah turned to see Richard emerging from the shadows, his face a mixture of concern and determination. "Get away from her, Michael," Richard said, his voice laden with barely contained anger. Michael smiled, apparently unsurprised by Richard's appearance. "Ah, the man of the moment, have you come to silence me, old friend?" Sarah stepped back, caught between the two men. How did you know I was here?" she asked Richard. "I followed you," Richard admitted. "I'm sorry, but after everything that's happened, I was worried, and it seems I was right to be." "You see, Sarah," Michael interjected, "always controlling, always manipulating. Is this what you want in your life?" Richard took a step forward. "Don't listen to him, Sarah. Michael has always been a master of manipulation. Those photos, those documents, it's all fake." "Fake?" Michael laughed. "Why don't you tell her the truth, Richard? Why don't you tell her what really happened that night?" Sarah looked from one man to the other, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and doubt. Who should she believe? Who was telling the truth? "Enough," she finally said, her voice trembling but firm. "I want the truth. The whole truth. Now." Silence fell over the park, interrupted only by the distant sound of night traffic. Richard and Michael looked at each other, years of history and secrets weighing between them. "Very well," Richard finally said, his voice tired but determined. "It's time you knew everything, but not here. Let's go home, Sarah. I'll tell you everything that happened that night and why Michael is so determined to destroy us." Michael stepped forward, his hand moving towards his pocket. "You're not going anywhere until—" But his words were interrupted by the sound of approaching sirens. Police lights suddenly illuminated the park. "What have you done?" Michael growled at Richard. Richard simply shook his head. "It wasn't me, but it seems your past has finally caught up with you, Michael." As police cars pulled up nearby and officers began to approach, Sarah found herself in the middle of a scene. That seemed straight out of a movie. Her past, present and future seemed to converge at this crucial moment. The police car lights illuminated the park, creating a surreal scene. Sarah, stunned, watched as the officers approached cautiously, their hands near their weapons. "Michael Adams," one of the officers shouted, "you're under arrest for violation of parole and new fraud charges." Michael, cornered, looked frantically around, searching for an exit. His eyes landed on Sarah, and for a moment he seemed to consider using her as a shield. Richard, anticipating his intentions, quickly stepped between them. "It's over, Michael," Richard said, his voice firm but tired. "It's time you paid for everything you've done." With a grunt of frustration, Michael raised his hands in surrender. As the officers handcuffed him, he shouted towards Sarah, "Don't trust him. Everything I've told you is true." Sarah, overwhelmed by the events, staggered slightly. Richard gently held her by the arm, his touch bringing her back to reality. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Sarah nodded weakly, unable to form words. She watched in silence as the police took Michael away, the sirens gradually fading until the park was quiet again. "Sarah," Richard said softly, "I know you have many questions, and I promise I'll answer all of them, but not here. Let's go home where we can talk calmly." After a moment of hesitation, Sarah nodded. "Okay." The car ride to the Thompson mansion was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, Richard guided Sarah to his study, a cozy room full of books and family mementos. "Please sit down," Richard said, indicating a comfortable armchair. He remained standing, nervously pacing in front of the unlit fireplace. "Before we start, I want you to know that everything I'm going to tell you is the absolute truth. No more secrets, no more half-truths." Sarah settled into the armchair, preparing herself for what was to come. "I'm listening." Richard took a deep breath. "The night you disappeared, I was indeed negotiating an important deal. But it wasn't what Michael made you believe. We were closing an agreement to expand the company internationally. Michael was my partner at the time, and he had other plans." "What kind of plans?" Sarah asked, intrigued. Michael wanted to use the expansion as a cover for illegal activities, drug trafficking, money laundering things I flatly refused to participate in. We had a strong argument that night. He threatened to expose me, to ruin me if I didn't cooperate. Richard paused, his face a mask of pain and regret. "I was so absorbed in that fight, so worried about the future of the company, that I didn't realize you had snuck out of your room." Sarah frowned, trying to remember. "I snuck out? Why would I do that?" "Because you heard us arguing," Richard replied, his voice breaking slightly. "The nanny told us later that she had seen you go out to the garden, apparently scared by the shouting. When we realized, it was already too late." Tears began to form in Sarah's eyes. Fragments of memories, blurry and distant, began to surface in her mind. I remember being afraid. And then darkness." Richard knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Michael took advantage of the confusion. He kidnapped you, Sarah, not to save you as he made you believe, but to blackmail me. He wanted me to accept his terms, to get involved in his dirty business in exchange for your safety. But the photos he showed me," Sarah began, "manipulated." Richard interrupted. "Michael was always skilled with technology. He created those images to support his version of the story." Sarah processed every word, every revelation. Her world, already shaky, seemed to crumble and rebuild with each new piece of information. "Why didn't you find me sooner?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Richard lowered his gaze, the guilt evident on his face. "I tried, Sarah. I hired the best investigators, offered rewards, moved heaven and earth to find you. But Michael was cunning. He kept you hidden, moving, you from one place to another. And when I was finally close to finding you, he left you at that orphanage, erasing all traces." "And why now? Why did Michael decide to reveal all this now?" "Revenge," Richard replied simply. "When I discovered his illegal activities and reported him, Michael lost everything: his freedom, his fortune, his reputation. He swore he would get revenge, that he would take away what I loved most. And when he got out of prison and discovered that I had found you, he decided to use the truth as a weapon," Sarah completed. Finally understanding, Richard nodded. "By manipulating the facts, distorting the truth, he hoped to drive you away from me forever. It was his final revenge." A heavy silence fell over the room. Sarah stared fixedly at the fire Richard had lit in the fireplace, her mind processing everything she had learned. "Sarah," Richard said softly, "I know it's a lot to take in, and I'll understand if you need time, if you can't forgive me for not protecting you that night, but I want you to know that I've loved you every day since you disappeared, and that I never, ever stopped looking for you." Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting Richard's. She saw in them love, regret, and a silent plea for forgiveness and understanding. Sarah began, her voice trembling with contained emotion. I need time to process all this, but I think that, for the first time in a long time, I can see a way forward, a path where maybe with time and effort we can be a family again. Richard felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't complete forgiveness, it wasn't an instant reconciliation, but it was hope. And for now, that was more than enough. Thank you, he said simply, gently squeezing Sarah's hands. As the fire crackled softly in the fireplace, father and daughter remained in silence, each contemplating the future that lay ahead of them. An uncertain future, yes, but one that, for the first time in years, seemed to shine with the promise of healing and love. The days that followed the night of revelations were a whirlwind of emotions for Sarah and Richard. Both navigated uncharted territory, trying to rebuild a relationship that had been brutally interrupted years ago. Sarah decided to take some time off from her job at the supermarket to process everything she had learned. Richard, respecting her space but eager to reconnect, offered her to stay at the family mansion. You don't have to if you're not comfortable, he assured her, but your old room is still there, exactly as you left it, and there's plenty of space if you prefer a different room. After consideration, Sarah accepted. Entering the Thompson mansion was like stepping through a time portal. Family photos adorned the walls, capturing happy moments from a past that seemed to belong to another life. Her old room was a sanctuary of memories, stuffed animals, children's books, and a collection of dolls that instantly awakened echoes of memory. In her mind, "May I?" she asked, pointing to a porcelain doll in a blue dress. Richard nodded, excited. Of course it was your favorite. You called her Lily. Sarah took the doll in her hands, gently stroking its blonde hair. Suddenly, a vivid memory hit her. It was her 6th birthday. Richard entered the room with a large package wrapped in shiny paper. "Happy birthday, princess," he said, his face lit up with a smile. Sarah opened the gift enthusiastically, revealing the beautiful porcelain doll. "It's perfect, Daddy, thank you." Tears began to run down Sarah's cheeks. "I remember," she whispered. "I remember this day." Richard, moved, approached, but stopped, unsure if he should hug her. Sarah, however, closed the distance between them and sank into his arms, sobbing softly. The days turned into weeks, and little by little, Sarah and Richard began to rebuild their relationship. They shared meals, looked at old photo albums, and Richard told her stories from her childhood, helping her fill in the gaps in her memory. One afternoon, as they walked through the garden, Sarah stopped in front of a beautiful rose bush. "Your mother planted them," Richard explained. "She said each rose represented a year of our love." Sarah gently caressed a petal. "I wish I could have known her better." "She would be so proud of you," Richard said, his voice laden with emotion. "Of the strong and brave woman you've become." Sarah smiled, grateful for his words. "Tell me more about her." And so, sitting on a garden bench, Richard shared stories of Catherine, her contagious laughter, her passion for architecture, her unconditional love for her family. Meanwhile, in prison, Michael Adams faced the consequences of his actions. His revenge plan had failed, and now he faced a long sentence for his new crimes. One day he received an unexpected visit. Sarah entered the visiting room, her face a mask of determination. "Have you come to gloat?" Michael asked bitterly. Sarah shook her head. "I've come to tell you that I forgive you." Michael looked at her, surprised. "What? I'm not doing it for you," Sarah continued. "I'm doing it for me, because carrying this hatred and resentment only hurts me. So I forgive you, and with this, I close this chapter of my life." Without waiting for a response, Sarah stood up and left, leaving a stunned Michael and, for the first time in years, genuinely remorseful. Back at the Thompson mansion, Sarah found Richard in his study, reviewing some documents. "How did it go?" he asked. Concerned, Sarah smiled, feeling as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Well, I think I can finally leave the past behind and focus on the future." Richard nodded, proud of his daughter's strength. "And how do you see that future?" Sarah thought for a moment. "Different, exciting, I want to learn more about the family business, maybe even study business administration, and I'd like us to work on it together." Richard's eyes lit up with joy and pride. "I would love that, Sarah, more than you can imagine." At that moment, the sound of a piano came from the living room. Sarah looked at Richard, surprised. "Who's playing?" Richard smiled mysteriously. "Why don't you go see?" Intrigued, Sarah headed to the living room. There, sitting at the old piano, was her former nanny, Rose, playing a familiar melody. "Rose!" Sarah exclaimed, running to hug her. The elderly woman smiled, tears of joy in her eyes. "My dear child, how you've grown." "Do you remember her?" Richard asked, who had followed Sarah. Nodded emotional fragments, but her voice, her face, I'd recognize them anywhere. "Rose has been with us since you were born," Richard explained. "I thought it would be good for you two to reunite." As Rose began to play another melody, Sarah sat down beside her on the piano bench. Her fingers, guided by a muscle memory she thought lost, began to move over the keys, joining the melody. Richard watched the scene, his heart overflowing with love and gratitude. After years of darkness and separation, light had finally returned to the Thompson house. As the music filled the house, Sarah felt the last pieces of her identity falling into place. She was no longer just Sarah, the orphan from the supermarket, nor Emily, the lost little girl. She was both and something more. A strong, resilient woman, forged by the trials of the past, but with her eyes set on the future. Weeks turned into months, and life in the Thompson mansion found a new rhythm. Sarah, determined to understand the family business, began accompanying Richard to the office. Her fresh perspective and her experience working at the supermarket brought innovative ideas that revitalized the company. One afternoon, while reviewing some reports in the study, Richard noticed Sarah distracted, looking out the window with a thoughtful expression. "What's wrong, honey?" he asked. Concerned, Sarah turned to him, a mixture of excitement and nervousness on her face. "I've been thinking, do you think we could use the company's resources to help other children like me? Children who have lost their families or who need a home?" Richard felt his heart swell with pride. "I think that's a wonderful idea. In fact, what would you say if we created a foundation? We could call it the Emily Foundation, in honor of the girl you were and all the children who need help." Sarah's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "Yes, we could provide education, medical care, even help with adoption processes. And maybe we could start by renovating the orphanage where I grew up." "That sounds perfect," Richard nodded. "And I think your mother would be immensely proud of you for this." Sarah smiled, a mixture of joy and nostalgia in her expression. "I wish she were here to see it." "She is here," Richard said softly, placing a hand over Sarah's heart. "In every decision you make, in every act of kindness, I see so much of her in you." Moved, Sarah hugged her father, allowing herself to fully feel the love and connection that had been denied to her for so long. The following months were a whirlwind of activity. The Emily Foundation became a reality, and soon began to make a real difference in the lives of needy children. Sarah immersed herself in the work, finding a purpose and passion she had never experienced before. A year after their reunion, Richard and Sarah visited the orphanage where she had grown up, but this time it wasn't a melancholic visit to the past, but a glimpse into the future. The building, once deteriorated, now shone with a new coat of paint. The courtyards, previously neglected, were full of playground equipment and children's laughter. As they toured the renovated facilities, Sarah noticed a small girl sitting alone in a corner of the yard, hugging a worn teddy bear. Something in the girl's lost gaze touched a sensitive fiber in Sarah. She approached and knelt beside the little one. "Hello," she said softly. "What's your name?" The girl looked at her with big brown eyes. "Lucy," she responded timidly. "That's a beautiful name, Lucy." Sarah smiled. "You know, I used to live here too when I was little." Lucy's eyes widened in surprise. "Really? And did you find a family?" Sarah nodded, looking at Richard, who was watching the scene with emotion. "Yes, I found it. And I know you'll find yours too." As Sarah talked with Lucy, Richard felt a wave of love and pride so intense it almost overwhelmed him. Seeing his daughter, who had suffered so much, extend her hand to help others was more than he had ever dreamed of. That night, back at the mansion, Sarah found Richard in the garden contemplating the stars. "Dad," she said, the words still new but increasingly natural on her lips. Richard turned, smiling. "Yes, honey. I've been thinking about Lucy and all the children at the orphanage. I was wondering if maybe we could consider adoption." Richard looked at her, surprised but moved. "Are you sure? It's a big responsibility." Sarah nodded, determined. "I know, but after everything we've been through, after everything I've learned about love and family, I feel it's the right thing to do. I want to give a child the home that I lost and regained." Richard hugged his daughter, tears of joy in his eyes. "I think you're the bravest and most compassionate person I know, and if this is what you want, count me in." As they embraced under the starry sky, Sarah felt a peace she had never experienced before. The path had been long and difficult, full of pain and loss, but here, in this moment, with her father by her side and the future full of possibilities, Sarah knew that she had finally found her place in the world. The Thompson story didn't end here. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. With each day, with each act of love and generosity, they wrote a new chapter, one filled with hope, forgiveness, and the transformative power of family love. And so, as night enveloped the Thompson mansion, father and daughter remained in the garden, contemplating the stars and dreaming of the bright future that awaited them.